Welcome to Referring a Case for Restorative Justice in Orange County. This half-hour video is intended for anyone seeking to learn more about restorative justice and how it works, and for attorneys who want to know how to refer a case to restorative justice in Orange County, North Carolina. For attorneys, this presentation has been approved for 30 minutes of CLE credit by the North Carolina State Bar. I'm Elizabeth Hamburger, Restorative Justice Associate at DSC. That's me in the orange sweater. DSC's tagline is Dialogue in Support of Community, and we are Orange County's local community mediation center. We've been around for almost 50 years. The other person pictured on this slide is CJ Suit. He's my colleague and the other member of our restorative practices team. The focus of my work is restorative justice in cases that are referred directly from attorneys, mostly in adult cases, and I also do district court mediation. CJ focuses on juvenile cases that are referred from court counselors or from the Criminal Justice Resource Department. Let me give you a sense of where we're going today. First, I'm going to talk in very basic terms about what restorative justice is. Next, I will describe the restorative justice process. In other words, what facilitators do when we go about facilitating a case in restorative justice. And third, I'll talk about how restorative justice interfaces with the court system and how attorneys can refer a case. But let's start with a real-world example. This is a felony case that was resolved through restorative justice in Durham County. A young man was riding with friends in a car one night when he fired a gun out of that moving car and into some woods that were right next to a residential area, badly scaring those nearby. He was charged with a felony, and the assistant district attorney referred his case for restorative justice. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice focuses on harms to individuals and communities like the crime I just described. The goal is to repair harm by centering the needs of people who have been harmed and providing an opportunity for people who have caused harm to take accountability. Restorative practices exist on a continuum, from preventative to responsive. Examples of preventative practices are ones that help to build community or maintain community, and on the responsive end, we have practices that aim to repair harm. So what we call restorative justice is on the responsive end of the continuum, and usually that means it exists as an alternative to or in conjunction with the legal system. What all restorative practices have in common is that they are relational. They prioritize human relationships. When conflict and harm occur, restorative justice's goal is to set those relations right. This is true even between two people who've never met before the incident of harm. Humans are in relationship with each other simply by virtue of being human. And, moreover, the harm itself creates a relationship that needs to be set right. So another way to say the same thing is that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships, and those violations create obligations. The central obligation is to, as much as possible, do right by the people you've harmed. Restorative justice is based on the belief that everybody belongs, even when we've caused harm. It's how justice was and is practiced in indigenous societies that recognize we humans are all truly dependent on each other for survival. If we're interdependent, we can't just throw someone away, even when they've caused harm. Everyone causes harm at some point in their lives. We've all caused harm, and we've all been harmed. When we recognize our interdependence, we realize that we have to find a way to restore someone to the community, even when they've caused harm. That's what the restorative process aims to do. The legal system asks, what law has been broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished? Restorative justice asks different questions. But before I tell you what those are, let's do a little exercise. I'm going to ask you to think back to a time when you were harmed by another person. Think about what feelings you had at that time. Please press pause on the recording and write down a list of all the feelings you remember having at that time when you were harmed. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to write down a list of feelings you had when you experienced harm. When I do this with a live group, I then ask everyone to go around and share the list of their feelings. The feelings that frequently come up are things like sadness, shame, betrayal, embarrassment, hurt, anger. Usually there's a lot of repetition when we go around the circle. In other words, the feelings that people share show that we're all somewhat similar in the way we feel when we've been harmed. But at the same time, most of us seem to experience a mix of feelings when we're harmed. We experience a lot of things, not just one feeling. Now, I'm going to ask you to make a second list. Please think back to that same time when you were harmed by another person, and think about what needs did you have that were created by that harm. Once again, please pause the recording and write down a list of all the needs you can remember having. Welcome back. I hope you had an opportunity to write your list of needs from being harmed. As with the last prompt, when I do this exercise with a group, there's usually a lot of overlap in the needs they list. I needed to be listened to. I needed to feel safe. I needed to know that it wouldn't happen again. I needed to know that the person understood what they had done. I needed time to myself, or I needed to be with other people. And sometimes, one or two people might list punishment as a need they had, that they wanted the person who had harmed them to be punished, or I want them to suffer. But that's not the most common response, and I've never heard anybody list that as their only need. But to a large extent, punishment is what our legal system offers. Restorative justice, on the other hand, gives space for the multitude kinds of needs that people have when they've been harmed. It asks, who has been harmed? Recognizing that the answer might include people beyond the people officially listed as victims in the legal pleadings. What are their needs? Recognizing that those needs probably include things other than the suffering of the person who hurt them. Whose responsibility is it to meet those needs? And how can the harm be repaired? So RJ is pretty different than what forms the basis of our legal system. However, it is actually happening in local courts in Orange County. That's thanks to funding that my office, DSC, receives from the county. My task as Restorative Justice Associate is to increase restorative justice capacity in Orange County by educating court actors, taking referrals, and then facilitating the cases. Facilitating the case means actually conducting the restorative justice process with the participants. And I think it's important for the lawyers to know at least a little bit about what this process looks like. The goal of the restorative justice process is for everyone involved in an incident of harm to find a shared sense of understanding about what happened and to move forward together to find ways to repair the harm. When we bring people together to talk about an incident of harm, we call that a conference. The steps before that we call pre-conferencing. That's where we meet with everyone separately until they're ready to meet or they decide not to meet. In the pre-conference meetings, the facilitators will hold separate meetings with the person who has caused harm and then meet separately with the person who has been harmed. We encourage participants to bring support people to these meetings, and those support people will also participate in the process. Facilitators will spend as much time as necessary helping a person feel comfortable and connected before delving into the difficult details of the incident. I like to ground the process, including the pre-conference meetings, in shared values to help people recognize that this process is really different from the adversarial process that happens in a courtroom. So we talk about values like honesty, responsibility, integrity, respect, and other values that participants feel are important to them. The most important thing the facilitators bring is non-judgment. People who have been involved in an incident of harm, whether they're the person who caused the harm or a person who has been harmed, often feel a lot of shame and feel that they are under threat. A lot of people come into the process in a fight or flight mode, and we use various practices, above all, non-judgmental listening, to help people put down some of those defense mechanisms so they can speak honestly, first with the facilitators and then eventually with the person on the other side. We base the process around a set of questions. What happened? What were you thinking and feeling at the time? What are you thinking and feeling now? Who has been affected and how? And what can be done to make things as right as possible? In the conference, we bring everyone together to answer these questions in each other's presence, because when everyone has a collective understanding of what happened, they're better able to think together about what can be done to make things right. This final RJ question, what can be done to make things as right as possible, leads to what we call a repair agreement. When the parties answer that question together in the conference meeting, the facilitators will help them turn the answers into an agreement about what everyone will do to move forward. So, you remember the case I talked about at the beginning with the young man who fired his gun out of the moving car. In that case, the restorative justice process included the young man meeting with members of that neighborhood to apologize and to hear their experience of what had happened. One man told him about how his young daughter had trouble sleeping after being frightened by the gunshots. The young man wrote an apology letter to neighbors, explaining that he had fired the gun to, quote, let off steam, but now better understood the impact of his actions. In addition to that letter and his conversations with members of the neighborhood, the young man made a video about gun safety to be shared throughout the community. And he participated in a cognitive behavioral intervention program so that he could learn better ways to release stress than firing a gun. The charges were later dismissed by the prosecutor. The young man who was involved in that case gave us permission to share his apology letter to educate people about restorative justice. I will not read you his entire letter, but it began with, I am the reason why some of you might feel scared or worried about gunshots on the date in question. And it ended with, from the bottom of my heart, I am sorry for disturbing the neighborhood with such stupid actions. Apologies are a common part of a repair agreement, but they are rarely the only part. I think we all as humans have experienced how apology alone can sound hollow or disingenuous, and that's why RJ focuses on accountability rather than just apology. RJ practitioner Mia Mingus teaches that accountability has 4 parts: self-reflection, repair, apology, and changed behavior. So in a repair agreement, we usually try to pair apology with action. Action to repair the harm and action to prevent it from happening again. That's what creates accountability. So what cases are appropriate for restorative justice? Any case that involves harm, where someone is open to taking accountability for that harm, and there's a need for healing. In other words, the group of cases appropriate for restorative justice is very broad. There is no harm too serious to be appropriate for restorative justice. Restorative justice might be particularly appropriate in these cases, where the person who caused harm expresses remorse, wants to take accountability, wants to better understand the impact of their own actions, where the person who was harmed wants to talk with the person who caused the harm, wants an apology, or has questions that only the person who caused the harm could answer, where there's a relationship to preserve or to restore, where there are needs of any party that the traditional legal system just can't meet, and where the harm affected people beyond the person officially identified as the victim. Because restorative justice recognizes that harm doesn't just affect individuals, but entire communities. For example, in the Durham case I told you about with the young man who fired his gun into the woods near the neighborhood, that affected lots of people beyond the person who called the police. Similarly, a case of illegal gun possession or a case of selling illegal drugs, that might not have a specific individual that we call the victim, But the reason those are crimes is because they affect the whole community. That makes them appropriate for restorative justice. In those cases, the facilitators will find community representatives who can participate in the process to help the person charged understand how their actions affect everyone. Now, there are some particular circumstances where we found we need to be more cautious in pursuing restorative justice. These cases are not a definite no, they're not a red flag, but they raise yellow flags. First, cases of intimate partner violence. As a general rule, we do not take these, but we are open to considering it in unique cases, especially in cases where no children are involved and where the parties have no intention of continuing their romantic relationship. Also, unaddressed mental illness and addiction also raise a yellow flag, simply because we've found that people with serious psychiatric issues or active addiction are often not in a position to successfully participate in the introspective work required by a restorative justice process. I'm sometimes asked how restorative justice differs from mediation. In mediation, there is a dispute to be negotiated, and the parties are in conflict over different positions with regard to that dispute. The mediator will help the parties consider the interests that underlie their positions to hopefully find solutions that are mutually satisfactory and address everybody's interests. Restorative justice is not focused on a matter in dispute, but rather a particular harm with the goal of healing and setting relations right. The focus is on accountability and the needs that have arisen from the harm. Another unique thing about restorative justice is that it can include a broader circle of people who were affected by an incident of harm. For instance, if you think about breaking and entering, where the person whose home was broken into suffered harm and is the official victim, but neighbors may have been affected as well. Restorative justice could be an opportunity for those neighbors to be involved in the process. Finally, restorative justice often includes more one-on-one prep with the parties individually than mediation does. I will note that restorative justice does not require that there be one harmed party and one person who caused harm. We can do restorative justice processes when there's multi-directional harm. For instance, a school fight where one student has been charged but both caused harm. We can use restorative practices to address that situation. In order for a case to be referred for restorative justice, all the participants have to consent. What this means is that the defendant needs to understand the legal consequences of participating in the restorative justice process and should be willing to acknowledge some extent of responsibility for the harm. They do not need to acknowledge from the outset or ever that they are responsible for everything the state may have accused them of. But they do need to be willing to take responsibility to some extent. For victims, we never want to accept a restorative justice referral if that would do harm to the victim. So we expect prosecutors to inform victims of the referral to restorative justice and the legal consequences of that referral. And if the victim objects, DSC cannot take the case. If there are multiple victims, at least one needs to consent. And if the prosecutor is unable to reach the victim to gain consent, that will not prevent DSC from taking the case. Victims do not need to agree to personally participate in the process. If the victims do not want to personally participate, there are ways we can modify the process to make it work without their participation. Restorative justice processes generally take about 90 days, and possibly longer for more serious harm. So please do not get a court order for restorative justice referral without checking with DSC to make sure that we can accept the referral and that the court has given enough time. So, if you think you have a case where restorative justice might result in a better outcome than litigation, you can refer it by contacting me. The first thing I will ask is whether both parties, the state and the defense, are making this referral jointly. I can't take referrals just from one party. But if you're a defense attorney and you have a case that you think will be a good fit for RJ, I'm happy to talk to you about it. I'm happy to talk to the DA about it, and vice versa. I'm happy to speak with defense attorneys if the prosecutor thinks it might be a good case for restorative justice. When it comes time to make the referral, I will send you a link to our online referral form, or you can find it at our website, which is dscnc.org. Go to Restorative Practices over here on the right, and you can scroll down to Restorative Justice, where you will find the online RJ referral form. Click there, and you will be directed to this form, which will allow you to input all of the information that we need in order to accept the referral. Attorneys for both the state and the defense must also sign DSC's Attorney Restorative Justice Referral Agreement, which can also be found on the Restorative Practices page of the DSC website. The referral agreement does two things. First, it states that both parties agree that nothing said in the restorative justice process will be used in court. It's very important to a restorative justice process that everyone feel able to be completely honest without fear that what they say could be used against them in any future litigation. So when I meet with participants, I will also have them sign an agreement regarding confidentiality. The other purpose of having attorneys sign the restorative justice referral agreement is for them to acknowledge that they've read DSC's policies and procedures in restorative justice cases. Those policies and procedures are attached to the agreement, and many of them are covered in this presentation. One thing that the policies and procedures make clear, which I want attorneys to understand, is that I consider it my role to protect the integrity of the RJ process by trying to keep it as separate from the legal system as possible. This means that there may be questions you have about the process that I might not be able to answer for you. The things that I can share with you are whether the process is ongoing, whether a party is participating, whether a repair agreement has been reached, and whether it has been fulfilled, and any other information that the parties agree to disclose. There are some circumstances where once we get into a process, the facilitators realize that it cannot continue safely for all participants, and we will inform the attorneys of that outcome, but we may not tell you exactly why the process didn't work in order to protect the confidentiality of the parties and the integrity of the process. On the question of legal outcome, our program in Orange County does not dictate what legal outcome will result from the defendant participating in the restorative justice process. That's something that should be worked out between the prosecutor and the defense attorney. But I will say that in my experience, the restorative justice process is most effective when it is as far removed from the possibility of punishment as possible. In other words, my preference is to receive pending cases where the case is continued for completion of the restorative justice process, and if the person completes the process, the charges will be dismissed. In my opinion, this keeps the process as separate from criminal punishment as possible, and that makes for a more successful restorative justice outcome. And that's what happened in the case that I told you about at the beginning. So the young man completed the process and his charges were dismissed. Now, think for a few seconds about what could have happened to this young man if his case had not been referred to restorative justice. In addition to facing possible jail time, he would have had the collateral consequences of a criminal record, possibly a felony record, including housing and employment consequences, and possibly immigration consequences as well. He would have been pushed to the edges of society, rather than having the opportunity to make amends. And think about the consequences for the neighbors, the people who heard the gunshots that night. They likely would never have received an apology for what happened, and perhaps more importantly, they would have not have had an opportunity to understand what happened that night. They may have continued to assume that the shots were fired by someone with malicious intent who wanted to hurt someone, which probably would have left them feeling less safe. I really hope that this presentation has given you some information so that you can understand restorative justice better, and if you're a lawyer, so you feel comfortable referring a case to restorative justice. This recording has been approved for 1/2 hour of general CLE credit from the North Carolina State Bar. And in order to receive credit, you will need to send me the answers to these questions by email. My email address is elizabeth@dscnc.org. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about restorative justice. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime to talk about a case or to get more information. I look forward to hearing from you.